So here we are with our final lecture on the last chapter of Descartes' Meditations. This sixth meditation is on the existence of material things and the real distinction between the mind and the body. One thing to point out here is don't confuse what's going on here with the topic in the fifth meditation, which was on the essence of material things. Here we're going to make one of our final moves in the book and actually discuss and explore the actual existence of material things and the external world. So one of our final missing pieces of the puzzle. So we'll start out with Descartes' claim that we know material things can exist, not that they do exist, but that they can exist because we have clear and distinct perceptions of them. But the question we're turning to here is, do they actually exist? We can actually induce, meaning we can actually assume that it's probable that material things exist, or as I put it here, that they likely exist through the imagination, believe it or not. Now, of course, likely exists is not the same as exists. This is just a educated sort of judgment that we make. This is not something that is definitive. It's something more definitive that we're going to be looking for in this final chapter. So, how does Descartes actually define in this sixth chapter the imagination? He says the imagination is a specific application of a faculty of knowledge to an intimately present body, which therefore exists. And again, this is something that is not the same as knowing definitively that the body or the external or material thing exists. It's something that is an induction. It's something that is more probabilistic in scope. So the faculty of knowledge that he's referring to here is the intellect, reason, understanding. And what he means here is that your imagination, when it pictures something, is sort of like throwing paint on a wall. So the wall would have to be there, right? The wall is something that we assume has to be present in order for your paint to stick anywhere, to complete the metaphor. But one thing that's unclear here, at least in the early going, is whether by body Descartes means all material things or just your own physical body, your corporeality. Saying intimately present could of course mean either of these. I will say that a couple pages later, by 49, it does seem most likely that Descartes is referring to his own body. But to show how we we've got a missing line here. It should say to show how we first make this judgment based on the imagination that a body likely exists. We actually need to examine how imagination and pure intellect are different. I can imagine the lines of a triangle as if the triangle was present. And I would do this in addition to what I intellectually know about the sum of the triangle's angles. But I can't actually imagine the lines of a chiliagon as if the chiliagon was present to me visually. And a chiliagon, by the way, is a 1,000-sided figure, so I can still know intellectual claims about the chiliagon without being able to imagine it. But anytime I think of a corporeal thing, something that is physical, something that has a body, Descartes says that I imagine it. And I do this kind of automatically. I do it from force of habit. But the problem is the imagination can only ever produce something that is confused. It can never produce something that is distinct, like the ideas that are grasped by the intellect. And this in part is why Descartes can't use the imagination to definitively prove the existence of the external world. And that's exactly what we're trying to prove here in this final chapter of the book. But consider, for example, the fact that the chiliagon, this 1,000-sided figure that we try to imagine or picture in the mind's eye, is the same as a 10,000-sided figure, right? You wouldn't be able to differentiate between the two, just like I used a similar example in our previous lecture. So compare these, though, to something like a pentagon, which we can both intellectually grasp, we can define it, and we can also picture it or imagine it. Descartes figures that the imagination has to require some sort of effort on the part of the mind, and this is why you can't just imagine that 10,000-sided figure. Descartes also adds that a mental effort of this sort is not required in order to understand something in a purely intellectual sense. He's not actually super clear about this, but it might be the case that because understanding is self-sufficient for grasping the figure, whereas imagining never, again, I have a typo there, sorry about that, imagining is never on its own self-sufficient for depicting a figure before the mind's eye. You can't really know the figure in that way. So, to put this in really simple terms, in order to picture one of these mathematical figures, even if it's something simple like a pentagon or a triangle, you would have to first know it. You would first need to have some sort of intellectual grasp of it before you could visualize it. So what then is imagination? Well, it's not required actually from my own essence. It's not anything that our nature as thinking things in fact requires. So we would still exist without our imaginations, Descartes says. And if it's true that we can exist without our imaginations, then imagination must be sourced somewhere else. It must depend on something that is distinct from me. It can't just be something that is entirely contained in my consciousness. So when the mind understands, Descartes says it turns towards itself and it looks at one of its ideas. So if we're talking about understanding what a pentagon is or understanding what a triangle is, what we mean here is the mind actually turns kind of towards its own content and focuses on one aspect of this content, one idea. But this isn't what happens when the mind imagines. When the mind is making some sort of action on the part of the imagination, it's actually turning towards the body, and it's intuiting in this body something that conforms, meaning something that matches up to an idea that's either understood by the mind or perceived by your senses. So again, the idea here is that imagination appears to require the body, just like in that paint metaphor I used a few minutes ago. But what's implicit here is a really big sort of side effect, and that is that imagination requires the senses. And we're already working here towards answering that question about the existence of material things and external reality. Again, imagination seems to require the senses. But so far, Descartes can't actually be completely sure of this. He can only claim that body probably exists, not that it certainly exists. And he writes, I do not yet see how the distinct idea of corporeal nature that I find in my imagination can enable me to develop an argument which necessarily concludes that some body exists. So how are we going to push forward here? Well, Descartes' actually going to focus on the five senses and not just the imagination, which he is going to discuss in the terms that we typically use as the mind's eye. So kind of picturing things with your eyes closed, right? Picturing a triangle in some sort of ideal mental space. So we have a new question. How can we find a reliable argument for the existence of material things using these five senses, not the imagination, not just the intellect? Now, first, before we get to that, I want to remind you of something that Descartes said earlier that maybe is obscure now, maybe we've forgotten. Descartes says it's by the inspection of the mind alone, right, that we can identify substance. Remember that this is the whole point of the examination of the wax candle. Yet what Descartes is saying here is that we have a distinct idea of corporeal nature in the imagination. Corporeal nature and substance, thus, are not completely the same thing. That's important. So the question now is whether this intellectual grasp of a substance, which, remember, has nothing to do with your senses, is corroborated or confirmed or enforced by the actual existence of the substance in the material world. If you think back, you can remember what he said about objective and formal reality. You can already see where Descartes is going to go with this. Again, working towards an argument for the existence of these material things. But before Descartes really gets to this, he spends a few pages actually recapitulating a lot of the key points from the whole book. He gives you a list of various sense experiences. He lists examples where the senses should be doubted. He also gives you a list of new credible beliefs about senses and how they relate to things. And important here is the point, or the fact that he says, I shouldn't trust everything from the senses, nor should I call everything from the senses into doubt, right? Again, you'll see this on the exam and on your quiz, so I want to highlight this. I shouldn't trust just everything from the senses. It's also not the case that I should doubt or call everything that the senses tell me into question. I don't need to fall into either of these two extremes. What I want is some sort of balance in the middle. And he adds, I can trust the senses in spite of the fact that oftentimes they do give me confused readings of the essences of things. So again, let's turn to the wax example. Your sense information to an extent is accurate. For example, when you burn the candle and you touch the resulting thing that's sitting there, it's warm, right? And that's not something that's completely inaccurate, right? That's something that does kind of match with what we think is there. So here's the big move that Descartes is going to make. To the extent that God is not a deceiver, Descartes thinks we know that for sure. God is not a deceiver. My sense perceptions of material things or corporeal things must be based on corporeal things that actually, in fact, exist. If they did not come from actually existing things, then God would have to be a deceiver. But I know he isn't. And the reason why I know he isn't is because I have a clear and distinct perception of God as perfect. So God could not be a deceiver. So we don't need to worry about that. Now there's an important qualification. Descartes will add that maybe it's the case that not all bodies exist exactly as I grasp them by sense. Again, this is just kind of elaborating on the points that I already covered on this slide. Since this sensory grasp is in many cases very obscure and confused. But, he adds, at least they do contain everything I clearly and distinctly understand. That is, everything understood in a general sense or considered in a general sense that is encompassed in the object of pure mathematics. Now, after sorting through the question about the existence of material things, which, just to be clear, the idea there was that we know that material things exist by way of the senses, Descartes is going to move to some specific comments on the mind-body distinction, which is one of the most famous parts of the book. So again, Descartes says that he has a clear and distinct perception of himself as a thinking thing, which by definition means something that is not extended. He's talking about intellectual substance here, which is not the same as a physical thing in space. Now remember that the thinking thing is the part of you that you most properly are, right? He says this is your nature, this is your essence, and by definition it's separate from your physical body. Even if you think that consciousness is something created by the brain and the nervous system and the body, your experience of consciousness, your experience of thinking is, again, by definition, separate from those physical substrates. But at the same time, you do have a distinct idea of a body specifically as something that doesn't think, right? You're aware of this part of yourself that is non-intellectual. And this part of yourself isn't as clear as the idea of yourself as a thinking thing, but it's still distinct, right? It's a matter of degree. It is something that you aren't quite as sure about, but you can still be pretty confident about. So it follows from these points that if we're right here, then we are really distinct from our bodies and we can exist without them. So what he's saying is there really is something like a soul. There really is something like an immaterial consciousness that goes on and outlasts the body. But I also have faculties for imagining and sensing things, and I can only understand these faculties for imagining and sensing because of the fact that I am a thinking thing who understands, and because these faculties themselves involve an active understanding in their formal concept. However, at the same time, other faculties like moving around don't depend on your status as a thinking thing who understands, but instead on your status as a physical or corporeal thing. So when you touch your desk, you aren't really understanding it, right? But often the ideas from these other faculties are against, or at least not dependent upon your will. So, for example, you might smell something bad when you walk in the streets of a big city, or you walk by that one section in front of the student union where it always seems to smell like trash, or maybe feeling your stomach digest your food after a big lunch. It's not something that you elect to experience. So, for example, when you taste a cake, we know that this sensation is predicated upon the real necessity of some physical thing. That is, one with the required formal reality to account for the objective reality of the taste. This is how we know the taste is there. Again, this is just a more sophisticated way of saying that we can be sure about the existence of external reality. The line a few sentences above where I said these faculties involve an active understanding in their formal concept is precisely this point, okay? So Descartes maintains that this cannot be himself, right, that is producing this sensation of the cake, right? The source cannot just be the understanding, right? Instead, it has to be that corporeal substance, right? Again, not the same thing as an active understanding in the formal concept, but some other thing, that outside material thing. So what we're saying here is this is how we know cake is real. Now remember, what makes this argument work, what drives this whole thing, is the position that Descartes takes that ideas have to have causes that have at least as much formal reality as the objective reality contained in the effect that is produced. Now here's where it gets kind of weird. Descartes just said a lot of things about the difference between mind and body and how we can trust at sometimes what the senses tell us. On the side of the body, Descartes will actually insist now that even though the mind and the body are distinct, even though they're different, even though you can continue on as a mind once your body is destroyed, you're actually one thing. Your mind and your body constitute one thing. This is often referred to as Cartesian dualism, right? So why do we think this on Descartes' terms? Well, the proof is that we feel pain, we feel thirst, and we don't do these things by way of pure intellect. We can only have these experiences, we can only have these feelings if the body actually exists. So this difference between mind and body is something that Descartes says we're taught by nature. We're in a way just programmed this way by God because we are made in a specific way as both body and mind, or physicality and consciousness. Now, all we mean here when we say taught by nature is that we're able to naturally tell these things apart in a very basic way, even though we are really the combination of the two. But Descartes will address one last sort of objection here in the end, and that is, we talked about erroneous judgments in the previous meditation, and even earlier in the book, but why is it that I sometimes experience bodily errors, like when, for example, poisonous food maybe tastes delicious to me? How do we explain why this can happen if everything that I've said here in this sixth meditation is true? Well, first we need to, before we answer this, look at two different types of bodily errors, and we're going to explain these two types using analogies. In the first type, we can use a clock to explain what's going on. So we might have a bad clock, and we know that it's bad based on how it's assembled. But even though it's been put together poorly, it still follows the laws of nature. So it wasn't constructed particularly carefully, but it still has to follow these very specific laws. So the other type is something we can explain in terms of in terms of thirst. And this is a bit closer to the example I gave above, like poisonous food that tastes pleasant. Imagine that there's a sick person who's thirsty, but this sick person, if she drinks, will actually die from taking a drink. So what we have here is nature is actually kind of leading this person the wrong way. Unlike in the first example where you had a clock that was poorly built but still following nature and just working wrongly, here you have nature kind of leading this person in a way that doesn't make sense. So this is what is concerning Descartes. And this latter example is the problem, right? How is it that there are defects in nature like this if God is good and if God is not someone who deceives us? Well, the explanation here is a bit technical. First, Descartes points out that the body is, by definition, always divisible, meaning you can always break the body up into smaller parts. You can always make it simpler and sort of keep breaking it down. But consciousness and the mind and your intellectual experience do not work this way. You cannot divide your mind. And the mind is not immediately affected by all of the parts of the body, but only by the part of the brain, Descartes thought, that was responsible for common sense. So when one part of your body moves another part, any part in between those two parts could set in progress the motion instead of that original part. So imagine that your brain feels pain when you stub your toe or bang your knee on something, even though the knee is in between the brain and the toe. So what did Descartes realize here? How the brain is just absolutely crucial for embodied sensation, how it's a sort of central point in the process. And he thought that the brain gives the mind sensations that are efficient and are appropriate, right? And by these terms, he means most conducive to the maintenance of a healthy human. So for example, you know to move your hand from a hot stove because of the pain that you feel, instead of leaving it there and just pushing in harder, right? This is a sensation that's efficient and appropriate, and it comes from the body but through the brain. But the problem is sometimes the sensation isn't actually there, like in the pain that someone feels in a phantom limb, like the example that I discussed in a few lectures earlier in this book. So this is the sort of situation we have with the person who feels thirsty but actually shouldn't drink, who actually would die if she took a drink. And what's Descartes' point here? Well, these sensations that are efficient and appropriate aren't always absolutely guaranteed. Descartes says it's better that we should know when to drink and how to feel pain in general than it is that we would avoid all misguided thirst, avoid all phantom pain, avoid all pain, period, right? You wouldn't even know when you held your hand over the hot stove that you should move it and that it was hurting you. So the error is happening because the body, usually correctly, but not always, tells us when we should drink. So this person is in the exceptional situation. This person is in the sort of scenario where the mechanism, right? Again, I've told you a few times, Descartes thought of reality in a very mechanistic way. The mechanism isn't working as it should. So it is in light of this, it's because of this, in other words, that sometimes we make mistakes. And this happens even though God is good, even though God doesn't try to trick or deceive us. So this person who shouldn't drink, feels thirsty, right, is actually better off than someone who would never know when she should drink and would starve as a child, right, or someone who would never know when to eat, right? It's better to have the signals usually work as they should, usually be efficient, usually be appropriate, than it would be to never have any sort of input and never have any idea how we should maintain the body. So at the end here, Descartes says, it's in our nature that we can't help being mistaken from time to time. It's just the way that it is. And I shouldn't necessarily doubt that the things my senses tell me are true. So, turning one more time to dreams, Descartes will say that there's one other way that we can kind of try to tell if we're dreaming or not. And he says, in a dream, you don't have memories. You don't have recollection of the other actions of life. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're not sure if you're dreaming or awake, one thing you can try to do is try to remember something. But Descartes will say one of the most important realizations that we should make, right, is we have to realize how infirm our nature is. We have to realize that we can't always overcome this, whether we don't have enough time or whether we can't think hardly, or how should I put this? Whether we can't think closely enough about it, right? Often life gets in the way, right? We do not have perfect intellects. We do not have a perfect relationship with our bodies. So what we need to do is try to use all of our senses, try to use our memories, and most importantly, use our minds, our intellects, our rationality, and look and see if the input that we're getting from all of these things is contradictory. And if we have no contradiction, then we probably don't need to doubt. If we have no contradiction, then we can probably trust in whatever it is that we think we know, or whatever it is that we think we're seeing or otherwise perceiving. So that's how Descartes ends the Meditations.